Hey guys, Dr. G. Today we're going to talk about motivation, which is chapter 13 in your textbook. Motivation is a set of forces that initiates, directs, and makes people persistent in their efforts to accomplish a goal. Probably one of the most important things that you can do as a manager is getting your employees motivated. So the basic concepts you need to understand are effort and performance. Because getting people to put forth effort so that their performance increases is really the underlying basis for motivation. And motivation starts with some unsatisfied need, so it's a matter of you figuring out what that need is. And we use, generally speaking, rewards to get people to be motivated, to reward their behavior after they've accomplished it so they're motivated to do it again. So we need to have an understanding of those. And together, those three components kind of give us a picture of how to motivate using our basic model of motivation, which is effort directed toward performance. And as we go through this material, the model will become increasingly more complex as we add additional components to it. So in its basic form, when we think about job performance, there's sort of this assumption that, well, you just simply motivate your employees and everything is fine and dandy, but the reality is there is a little bit more to job performance than simply motivation, because you can have all the motivation in the world, but if you don't have the ability to do the job, then the motivation isn't going to get you very far. Likewise, there could be situational constraints. So if you have a very motivated employee who wants to go out and sell more items, but there aren't enough products in stock, that's a big situational constraint. So all of his or her motivation isn't going to get them very far. So we, while our focus is on motivation, we do need to always consider that there are other factors that influence performance besides motivation. So I alluded to before, one of the primary functions of motivation is satisfying some sort of need. So this unmet need creates tension, and the tension drives the individual to seek ways of trying to reduce the tension, and hence they become more motivated. And that's kind of described in this model here. There's an unsatisfied need, tension, energized to take action, and then the effort, which is where the motivation kicks in, which leads to performance. One of the book's models that they talk about, or theories that they talk about, is Maslow's hierarchy, and you may have heard about it in other classes. And I put this in yellow. There has never, ever been any support for Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or the notion that we satisfy lower level needs before going to higher level needs. That's just garbage. So I do want you to know that. And if you ever encounter it in another textbook again or in another course again, I want you to say that there's never been any support for it, because it's maddening to me how this has proliferated for so long when there's no support for it. And Aldifer did say that people can be motivated by more than one need at a time. And McClelland indicated that the degree to which one particular need motivates people varies from person to person. So some things may be motivating to me, but not necessarily to you, and vice versa. Oops, okay. So the next theory we're going to talk about is called equity theory. And equity theory has a couple of primary components. One is your inputs, what you bring to the table in terms of your job skills, your credentials, how many hours you work, how hard you work, etc. Those are your inputs, and your outcomes are the rewards that you get, be it compensation or whatever. And the other component is reference. So when we think about, are we being paid fairly, usually the question is fairly to whom or fairly to what. So if I'm getting paid $50,000, I might think I'm being paid very fairly if I'm comparing myself to janitors. But if I'm being paid $50,000 and I'm comparing myself to say aerospace engineers, I would be thinking that I'm severely underpaid. So what equity theory says, and I want to be clear about this, we are motivated when we are in situations of inequity. So if we experience equity, we look at our inputs and outputs and someone else's inputs and outputs and say, pretty fair, pretty equitable. We're not motivated to do anything. So equity theory says that we're motivated to reduce inequities. So there's two different types of inequities. The first is an under-reward, when your outcomes are lower than, relative to your inputs, are lower than the referent other persons or the referent other organization, could be the entire field. And the other situation is over-reward, and that's when your outcomes relative to your inputs are better than that of the referent. So I added this slide, which kind of depicts it a little more. So this is an under-reward situation, so your outcomes relative to your inputs are less than that of someone else's. And this is an equity situation where your outcomes relative to your inputs are equitable relative to someone else's. And the third situation is the over-reward that I alluded to on the previous slide, where your outcomes relative to your inputs are greater than someone else's. So, and in this case, person A is you and person B is whoever the referent other is. So what equity theory says is in this situation of inequity, as well as this situation of inequity, you're motivated to do something to reduce the inequity. But what you would do would be very different for those two situations. So for example, if I discovered that I'm under-rewarded relative to a coworker, I might be motivated to ask for a raise. I would not be motivated to work harder, because working harder would increase my inputs, so that would actually create a greater inequity if I worked harder. So I might work less hard. I might be motivated to work less hard if I'm in an under-reward situation, or I might be motivated to say something to my boss about, hey, person B's not really doing that much, to try and get my boss to increase person B's inputs. In the over-reward situation, that's where I look at what I'm making and I say, gosh, am I really worth this? Look at what so-and-so makes, and they're putting in the same amount of effort. So I feel like almost embarrassed by how much reward I'm getting. So that, on the other hand, would motivate me to work harder, to sort of justify that I'm getting the outcomes that I'm getting relative to my counterpart. And so this slide here sort of suggests ways that you can react to different types of inequity, as I just alluded to. And going back to our model that we presented before, we're now sort of adding equity theory in here as ways, as what you do between being energized to take action and the efforts. Oops. Okay. So in terms of motivating employees with equity theory, the first thing that you want to do as a manager is start looking for where the inequities are and trying to address them. You don't need to wait for the employee to ask for a raise. If you notice that there's an inequity, you might want to just offer it. You can also look at ways of reducing employees' inputs. So maybe shifting some of the workload that's on person A over to person B. In addition, you want to make sure that the decision-making processes that your organization uses are fair. And by fair, when we talk about justice, we talk about sometimes it's actually 3 or 4, but for the simplistic purposes of our textbook, distributive justice and procedural justice. So I might think, well, gee, for the amount of education I have, I should be making $200,000 a year. So I might say, well, what I'm making now is unfair. The distribution of rewards is unfair. But I also say, well, I'm in a state institution and the state budget's been cut, and it's not like I was personally being targeted. So the procedures or the processes that were used to make the decision about how much money I make, I might think are reasonably fair. So in that case, I wouldn't necessarily be demotivated by it or dissatisfied by it. The next theory I want to talk about is what's called expectancy theory. And expectancy theory says that motivation is really a function of 3 things. One is the belief that one can perform the actual task. 2 is the belief that they will be rewarded if they do perform the task. And 3 is that the reward that's being offered is viewed as valuable and attractive, subjectively speaking, to that individual. So these are a little bit out of order. Expectancy is your belief that you can actually do the job. Instrumentality is your belief that you will get rewarded if you do in fact do it. And valence is the subjective value that you place on the reward. And one thing you want to notice here is that it's multiplicative, right? So it's valence times expectancy times instrumentality. And what that implies is that if any of those is low, or let's say any one of those is 0, then your motivation is going to be 0. So I can fully believe that I can perform task X, and I fully believe that my boss is going to give me the reward he promised when he initially asked me to do it. But if the reward is something like a rubber chicken, of 0 value to me, then I'm still not going to be motivated. So likewise, if I don't think I can, expectancy, if I don't think I can perform the task, even if the reward is very attractive and I think that my supervisor will provide it, I'm not going to be very motivated. So each of these has to be greater than 0 for motivation to happen. So here we've kind of added equity theory to the model. Over here, and figuring out the perceived equity and inequity. We've also added expectancy theory here, the valence, the instrumentality, and the expectancy to our overall model. So when we think about how do we use expectancy theory for motivating people, well, firstly, we need to find out what it is that people want. What do they put subjective value on? What do they put valence on? We also need to make sure that we're clearly linking the rewards to individual performance. So that means making good on promises. If I tell you that I'm going to give you a reward, that I deliver on it. And thirdly, empowering employees to make decisions if managers really want them to believe that hard work and effort will lead to good performance. The next motivation theory that we'll talk about is reinforcement theory. Very basic. I was a psych major when I was an undergrad, so we actually got to experiment with lab rats actually doing this. Reinforcement theory is basically that behavior that is rewarded will continue, assuming the reward is valued, and behavior that is followed by negative consequences will cease. So if you think about a rat going through a maze, sort of the classic psychology experiment, right? The rat goes one way and gets cheese, and then the rat learns that, hey, if I turn right here, I get cheese, so I'm going to keep turning right here at every opportunity. So the cheese serves as the reinforcement, and the rat gets the reinforcement and continues to do that. Likewise, if you give your employee a reward for engaging in a certain behavior and the employee values the reward, he or she will continue engaging in that sort of behavior. So adding reinforcement theory to our model down here, you can see it's getting a little complex. But I do want to underscore that while the model looks much more complex now, the reality is, as a manager, you won't be using all of these at the same time necessarily. It's a matter of sort of having as many arrows in your quiver as you can, so that you can sort of figure out what's the right one for a particular situation. With regards to reinforcement theory, I want to clarify positive reinforcement is very easy to understand. A positive behavior is followed by a positive consequence, so the behavior continues. Punishment, I'm going to skip down one. Punishment is also pretty easy to understand. A negative behavior is followed by a negative consequence. What people often get confused about is negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is different from punishment. Negative reinforcement means that there's something in the situation that is negative already, and the employee does the proper thing and as a result of doing the proper thing, the negative experience goes away. So it's getting rid of something negative. It's not adding something positive. I'm going to stop here and have you go through the rest by yourself in the interest of time. Have a great week. Take care. Bye.